Fog first, then the shape inside it. 40 stories of dead gray concrete rising out of the harbor like something that drowned standing up. A tower of welded silos, a clock with 4 blind faces. All of them stopped at 3:47. The whole town crosses the street to avoid its shadow. Now come closer, down to the gravel lot. A black Mercedes sits where it does not belong, and past it a girl in a thin coat 22 years old tips 41 quarters onto a motel nightstand and counts them twice. She has never heard the dead man's name. She does not know a letter is coming. She does not know that behind one rusted steel door, a stranger left her a fortune, a confession, and the reason her mother spent 20 years running. Look at her face, tired, steady, bracing for the next hard thing. She is about to climb that tower, and someone is already waiting at the top. The title said the tower was cursed. Elsie Marsh had read that word 40 times since Tuesday. Cursed. And she still didn't believe it. Except now she was standing at the base of the thing, and she wasn't so sure anymore, because the Cormorant Clock Tower was not a building. It was a wound in the sky. 40 stories of dead gray concrete rising out of the harbor fog like something that had drowned, standing up. A tower of stacked grain silos welded together decades ago, capped with an enormous 4-faced clock. The clock had stopped. All 4 faces, all frozen at 3:47. Nobody in this town could tell her what year they'd stopped, or why. They just crossed the street when they walked past it, and now it was hers. She pulled her coat tighter. The wind off the water had teeth. Behind her in the idling car, her little brother Milo pressed his face to the window and stared up. 8 years old, mouth open, awe and terror in equal parts. "Is it a castle?" he asked, when she opened his door. "No, baby." "Is it ours?" And Elsie looked up at the frozen clock, at the rust bleeding down the concrete like old tears, at the birds circling the top screaming into nothing. "Apparently," she said. "Yes." 3 days earlier she'd been counting quarters, 41 of them, spread across the motel nightstand in the gray light, enough for Milo's breakfast maybe, if she skipped hers, which she would, because she always did. Room 114 of the Seabird Motel smelled like carpet that had given up. The heater made a sound like a dying man clearing his throat, and on the ceiling right above the bed was a water stain shaped almost exactly like a reaching hand. Elsie had named it. Privately. She called it Larry. Because if you didn't name your problems, they named you. She was 22 years old, and she felt about 90. Not a metaphor. Her back hurt. Her knees hurt. There was an ache behind her eyes that never fully left. And that was the thing nobody who'd never been poor understood. It wasn't just the money. It was the weight. The math that never stopped running. Every dollar. Every hour. Every drop of hot water that ran out at exactly the wrong second. She'd learned to shower cold in November. It was February now. She barely noticed anymore. Milo was still asleep, one arm thrown over his face, his dark curls a mess against the pillow. He slept like the world owed him nothing and had never taken anything from him. And Elsie's whole job, her entire reason for breathing, was to keep it that way for as long as she possibly could. She'd been failing at it for 2 years. Their mother, Colette, had died when Elsie was 20 and Milo was 6. Fast. A pain in her side she'd ignored because there wasn't time to be sick when you were raising 2 kids alone. By the time anyone looked, it was everywhere. 3 weeks. That was all they got. 3 weeks between the word and the end. And on the last day, Colette had gripped Elsie's wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible and said something that made no sense. "When it gets bad enough, look in the tower." Elsie had thought it was the morphine. She'd been wrong. The letter came on a Tuesday. The motel didn't have mailboxes. It had Wade, a tired kid at the front desk who forgot things. But this time he remembered. He held up a cream-colored envelope as she crossed the lobby after her shift still smelling like fryer grease and burnt coffee. "Certified," he said. "Had to sign for you. Hope that's cool." She took it. It was heavy. The paper was expensive in a way that made her stomach drop, because expensive paper meant lawyers, and lawyers meant she owed somebody money she didn't have. The return address said Hollis and Vane, Attorneys, Portland. She opened it on the edge of the bed, careful like it might bite, and she read it 3 times before a single word stuck. A man named Alden Ferris had died. She had never heard that name, not once, not from her mother, not from anyone. He was 78, a shipping and grain magnate, reclusive. Rich in a way the letter tried to describe politely and failed, and in his will buried in a section the lawyer called a specific bequest was one line. Silo 41, Cormorant Terminal, bequeathed to Elsie Marsh, sole heir. She read that line so many times the ink started to swim. A silo. She'd inherited a silo. From a dead stranger who somehow knew her name, knew it well enough to spell it right. Marsh. Not Marish. Not March. Marsh. At the bottom of the second page, in a careful buttoned-up paragraph, the lawyer had written a sentence that made the hair on her arms stand up. He strongly encouraged her to seek legal counsel before doing anything with the contents, because the estate had generated, and here he chose his words like a man walking on ice, considerable interest from other parties. Elsie sat very still, and somewhere in the back of her skull, in a voice that sounded exactly like her mother's, a memory turned over in the dark. When it gets bad enough, look in the tower. She made 2 calls. The first was to the law firm. A polite woman confirmed everything and confirmed nothing. Yes, the letter was real. Yes, the bequest was valid. Yes, they'd verified her identity through records provided to the estate. "And how," Elsie asked, "did Mr. Ferris have my name?" There was a pause. 1 beat too long. Mr. Vane would be better suited to answer that. Mr. Vane never called. The second call was to her Aunt Roz, her mother's older sister, a hard, warm woman who lived outside Portland, and who Elsie spoke to maybe twice a year. Roz had a spare room, a steady husband, a life that had a floor under it. "You're serious," Roz said. "A silo, that's what it says." "From who?" "Alden Ferris." The silence on the line changed. It went from confused to something else, something Elsie couldn't name. "Aunt Roz, that name mean anything to you?" Roz asked. Too casual. Way too casual. "No. Should it?" "No," Roz said. And it was the fastest lie Elsie had ever heard. "Come stay with us. You and Milo both. Come look at your silo." The bus took 39 hours. Elsie counted them. Milo pressed crayons to a coloring book and narrated a war between a dragon and a school bus. He fell asleep against her arm somewhere in the mountains, and Elsie watched the country change through the smeared window, flat to hills, brown to gray to a green so wet it looked bruised. She held the letter in her lap the whole way. She kept rereading that one paragraph, considerable interest from other parties. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew the shape of it. She'd waited tables long enough to know when somebody wanted something and was being polite about it, right up until they weren't. Roz's house was warm, and it smelled like a pot roast, and it broke Elsie's heart a little standing in the doorway of it, because this was the thing she used to think all houses were, before she learned better. Roz's husband shook her hand too gently, like she might crack. And Milo vanished into the living room where a tablet and a bowl of pretzels awaited him like a coronation. That night after Milo was down, the 2 women sat at the kitchen table with tea. Neither of them drank, and Elsie asked the question straight. "You knew him?" Roz turned her mug in a slow circle. "I knew of him," she said finally. "Roz, your mother worked for a company that did his books, long time ago. Before you. Before all of it." She stopped. She looked at her hands. "There was a summer, and then there wasn't. And then your mother came home from Portland pregnant with you, and she never said one word about it. Not to me, not to anyone. And I learned a long time ago that when Colette went quiet about something, you didn't dig." Elsie's chest had gone strange, tight and hollow at once. "What are you saying?" she said. Not a question. She already knew. Roz looked up. Her eyes were wet and old and sorry. "I'm saying I don't know," she said. "But I've wondered for 22 years, and now a dead man knows your name." Cormorant Terminal sat at the dead end of Harborview Road, where the pavement gave up and the fog moved in, and Elsie's first thought when the tower rose up out of the gray was that the photos online had lied. Not because they made it look worse, because nothing could make it look this bad. 40 stories. A wall of welded concrete cylinders streaked with rust and salt, and something black that dripped from the seams like the building was rotting from the inside. At the very top, the 4 clock faces, blind and frozen, 347 forever, and around them, the birds, cormorants, hundreds of them, wheeling in the cold like the tower breathed them out and swallowed them back. Milo went silent in the back seat, which was how she knew it was bad. Milo was never silent. There were 3 cars in the gravel lot, a pickup, an old sedan, and a black Mercedes that sat there wearing the lot like an expensive coat wears a homeless man's shoulders. Wrong. Just wrong. Elsie noticed the Mercedes. She didn't know why. She just did. The office was a low tin box bolted to the base of the tower. Inside, a heavyset man named Foley took her authorization letter, took her ID, took a long look at her face, and slid a key across the counter on a ring stamped 41. "Elevator's dead," he said. "Has been for years. You want 41, it's stairs, second landing. Follow the numbers." "Thank you." She turned to go. "Miss." She turned back. Foley wasn't unfriendly, but he was choosing his words the way you choose your steps on ice. "Some folks came asking about that unit," he said. "Yesterday, and this morning." He slid a business card across the counter. "Left this. Figured you should have it." Elsie picked it up. Heavy stock, cream and steel. The kind of card designed to make you feel small just holding it. Kestrel Capital. And below that a name. Marcus Dane, Director of Acquisitions. And below that a phone number, an email, a website. She turned it over. On the back in neat blue ink, someone had written 8 words. "Call us before you decide anything. We'll make this easy." Elsie read it twice. Easy. In her experience, nobody ever offered to make something easy unless it was about to get very, very hard. She put the card in her pocket, right next to the letter, and she went to find the stairs. The stairwell wound up the inside of the tower like something inside a throat. Concrete steps, a metal rail furred with rust, a single string of caged bulbs that buzzed and flickered and left long gaps of dark between them. The air got colder as she climbed, and older. It smelled like wet stone and rat, and underneath both something she couldn't name. Old paper, old wood, the smell of time that had been shut in a box and forgotten. First landing, numbers in the 30s. She kept climbing. Second landing. And there it was, a steel door in a curved concrete wall, stamped with a black 41. And standing in front of it, hands in the pockets of a coat that cost more than Elsie's car, was a man. He wasn't doing anything. He was just looking at her door. He turned when he heard her, and his face went through a fast, practiced change, surprise to warmth in under a second, the kind of change a man learns when he's been told yes his whole life and treats no like a rumor. "Miss Marsh," he said. She stopped 10 feet back. "Who are you?" Not a question, a demand. "Marcus Dane." He smiled and put out a hand. "Kestrel Capital. I believe you have my card." "Yeah." She didn't take the hand. "How'd you know I'd be here today?" Something flickered across his face, just for a breath, something that wasn't as smooth as the rest of him. "We monitor estate proceedings," he said. Due diligence. We're interested in acquiring the contents of this unit. We'd hoped to reach you before you made any decisions you might regret. I don't regret much, Elsie said. Step back from my door. His smile held, recalibrated. Miss Marsh, I really think... I didn't ask what you think. Her voice came out level, quiet, and dense in a way that stopped him. Because you learn a voice like that carrying plates. You learn it telling a drunk man at table 9 that no means no. She'd built that voice over 2 years. It had never failed her yet. Marcus Dane looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. Take your time, he said. And there was something under the warmth now, a cold current under still water. But please, don't sign anything. Don't remove anything. Not before we talk. There are parties involved with resources you can't imagine. And I'd hate for a young woman in your situation to get in over her head. Your situation. 2 words, and he'd meant every layer of them. Elsie fit the key into the lock. Her hand didn't shake. She was quietly proud of that. The lock gave with a heavy, reluctant clunk. She grabbed the door handle and hauled it up. The door rose with a scream of metal that hadn't moved in years. She found the light switch inside the frame. Flicked it. The bulb stuttered. Once. Twice. Held. And Elsie Marsh stood in the doorway and looked at what a dead man had left her. It was not a silo full of grain. It was not a unit full of junk. It was an archive. The chamber went back 30 feet curved to follow the round of the tower, and every inch of it was organized. Not crammed, not dumped. Arranged. Wooden shelving ran floor to ceiling along both curved walls, and on those shelves boxes, hundreds of them, all labeled in the same cramped, careful hand. Contracts, Harbor District, survey records originals, correspondence personal, corporate filings Ferris Holdings, photographs, land documentation. In the center of the space a folding table, and on the table 2 things. A gray steel lockbox about the size of a bread loaf, and a large manila envelope sealed with a name written across the front in that same careful hand. Not Miss Marsh, not Ms. Marsh, just Elsie Marsh. The back of her neck went cold. She was aware of Marcus Dane still out on the landing behind her. She turned. Give me an hour. Miss Marsh, if you'd let me explain. An hour. She held his eyes. Or I go downstairs, and I tell Foley there's a man loitering outside my private property, and I ask him to call the police. And I have a feeling, just a feeling, that you don't want the police up here. Dane's jaw worked once. Then he nodded. Slow. I'll be downstairs, he said. And he went. Elsie stepped inside. The door had no way to close from within, so she went deep. All the way to the table at the back, as far from the landing as she could get, and she stood over the envelope with her name on it. She picked it up. It had weight, something inside it that wasn't just paper, something with a small, hard edge. She set it down. She wasn't ready. So she went to the shelves instead, because she was a person who did the small thing when the big thing was too big. She always had been. She pulled a box labeled Photographs, opened it. Inside dozens of smaller envelopes, each dated. She lifted the top one. Harbor Project, Site 1, 1986. Black and white, glossy, a waterfront, cranes, mudflats, a half-built frame of a building, men in hard hats standing in the mud like they owned the future. She didn't recognize the place, but she recognized the shape of the harbor. She put it back. She pulled another box. Correspondence personal, and she hesitated. Because personal wasn't hers. Personal was somebody's bones. She opened it anyway. Letters, real ones, paper and envelopes soft with age. She lifted the top one out. The postmark was smeared, but she could read the year. 2002. She slid the page out, and she read the first 2 lines. Dear Alden, I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to say it. She is yours, and I am not going to let you ruin her the way this place ruins everything." Elsie's hand went still. "She is yours." The handwriting. She knew the handwriting. She had a birthday card in a shoebox back at the motel, written in that exact hand. The loop on the G. The hard cross on the T. 22 years of grocery lists and permission slips, and "I love you" baby notes on napkins. Her mother. This was her mother's handwriting. Colette had written this letter to Alden Ferris about a child, about her. Elsie sat down. There was nowhere to sit, so she sat on the cold concrete floor of a dead clock tower with her back against a shelf of a stranger's secrets, and she put the letter down in her lap because her hands had started to do something she didn't have permission for. She thought about her mother, Colette Marsh, who had never once, not in 20 years, said a single word about Elsie's father, who had gone silent and stone-faced any time the subject drifted close, who had raised 2 kids alone on a bookkeeper's pay and never asked anyone for anything and died at 46 with a secret in her fist. When it gets bad enough, look in the tower, not the morphine, the map. Her mother had known. Her mother had always known. She'd left Elsie a door and a key and 22 years of silence, because whatever was in this tower had been dangerous enough to run from, dangerous enough to hide from her own daughter, dangerous enough to bury under 3 weeks of dying and hand over only at the very end. When it gets bad enough, and things had gotten bad enough. Elsie was not a woman who fell apart. She'd decided that a long time ago. Falling apart was a thing you did when someone was there to catch you, and no one had been there in a very long time. She had built herself an inside architecture. Walls, beams, load-bearing habits. And she called on all of it now. Breathe. One thing at a time. She picked up the manila envelope with her name on it. She turned it over. Under the flap, held down by a strip of yellowed tape, was one line in a different hand. Cramped. Careful. Old. Elsie. Forgive me. Read this first. A. She broke the seal. 3 things inside. A letter. Handwritten. 4 pages front and back. A photograph. Color. Faded to warm. A woman she'd know anywhere. Younger than any memory she had. Colette, maybe 25, laughing on a beach with her hair full of wind. And beside her, an arm around her, a man in his 50s, looking at her like she was the entire sky. And the third thing, a small silver key, much smaller than a house key, the kind of key that opens a lockbox. Elsie turned the photo over. On the back in that careful old hand, slower than the rest, like it had cost something to write Colette and me. Sable Beach, the only good summer, the one I threw away. Elsie started to read the letter. Alden Ferris had known her mother for one summer. He wrote it plainly, the plain, tired language of an old man with the clock running out. He'd met Colette when he was 54 and she was 25 and doing the books at the firm that handled his empire. He was a widower, rich and hollow. He described what happened between them as the best thing he'd ever been too much of a coward to keep. He'd ended it because he was afraid of scandal, of feeling, of a young woman who saw straight through his money to the frightened man behind it. She'd left, gone back home, and he had not known she was pregnant. He learned about Elsie 6 years ago from a private investigator he'd hired out of a guilt that had grown its own long roots. The man had found a letter Colette had started and never sent tucked in old company files, an accountant returned decades late. She is yours. By then, Colette was already gone. He wrote about the grief of that, the particular grief of a coward who runs out of time to be brave. He'd wanted to reach Elsie for years. He hadn't known how. He was afraid of being rejected, afraid of being too late, afraid he wrote of every single thing a man learns to be afraid of when he spends his whole life protecting his money instead of his heart. So in the end, he'd done the only thing he felt he had a right to do. He'd left her the tower, because the tower, he wrote, was not just a tower. Elsie read that line and felt the hair lift on her arms. His writing got smaller here, denser, like he was compressing something that had to be compressed. The contents of this unit relate to a property dispute that has been in the Oregon courts for years. The land under Cormorant Terminal, all 4 acres of harbor waterfront, I purchased legally in 1986. But my original documents, the deed, the survey, the signed agreements, went missing from my files. I have never been able to prove my ownership since. I believe the documents were stolen. I kept copies here in the one place no one connected to my name. The key in this envelope opens the box on the table. Everything in it is what I could not give the courts. Elsie stopped. She looked up at the steel lockbox on the table. She looked down at the small silver key in her palm, and she became aware slowly of something under the silence. Voices. Down on the landing. Not close, not far. Marcus Dane. And someone else. A lower voice, older, and she couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the shape of them, and the shape of them was a plan being agreed to. She looked at her phone. 39 minutes. She got up off the floor. The lockbox was heavier than it looked. She fit the little silver key, felt the mechanism catch, turned it. The lid opened. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had kept them flat and dry for God knew how long, was a stack of documents. She lifted the cloth. The deed. 4 acres of Portland waterfront, dated 1986. Notarized, sealed, a county survey record, signed, a purchase agreement, signed, and beneath all of it, one sheet of paper that was not a legal document. It was a page torn from a notebook, handwritten, fast, frightened, and the hand was neither Alden's careful print nor her mother's loops. It was a third hand, someone writing quickly, someone writing something they were terrified to be caught writing. A name at the top, Elias Pruitt, and a name in the body of the note, a name she already had, in her pocket, on heavy cream stock. The note described in the panicked shorthand of a confession, a transaction. Not a legal one, a payment, to a county records clerk, for the removal of the original 1986 purchase documents from the public record, so the deed could be challenged, so the land could be pried loose, so a certain group of developers could finally take the 4 most valuable waterfront acres on the coast. The group's name was in the note. Kestrel. Elsie read it twice, and then she read the last line, and her hands, which had held steady through the letter, through the photograph, through her dead mother's handwriting, finally began to shake. Because the last line of the note wasn't about Alden. It wasn't about the land. It said, "The bookkeeper made copies. C. Marsh knows. She has to be dealt with before she talks. C. Marsh. Colette Marsh. Her mother." They hadn't just stolen from Alden. They'd hunted her mother. That was why Colette ran. That was why the silence. That was why 22 years of no father, no explanation, no roots. Her mother hadn't been hiding a shameful summer. She'd been hiding her. She'd taken a 2-year-old and run to the other side of the country and buried her own name in bookkeeping jobs and cold apartments and cheap birthday cards, not out of shame, out of love so fierce it looked like a disappearance. Elsie sat on the floor of the tower, her dead mother's love in one hand and a dead man's fortune in the other, and the sound of the men who'd wanted her mother gone coming up the stairs, and she felt something settle inside her. Not soft, firm, dense, real. The way ground settles after a long, hard rain. The voices got louder. Elsie closed the lockbox. She stood. She looked around the tower once. She noted the boxes she hadn't opened. Land documentation. Survey records originals. She was starting to understand the size of what she was standing in. This wasn't a keepsake. This was a case, fully built, left for her like a loaded gun on a table. She tucked the manila envelope inside her coat, against her body, the letter, the photograph, her mother's face. She picked up the lockbox, heavy, but she could carry it, and she walked to the front of the unit. Marcus Dane stood at the top of the stairs, and beside him now was a second man, taller, older, a silver-haired man in a coat that made Dane's coat look cheap. He had the face of a man who had never once in his life heard the word no and understood it as anything but a delay. They both looked at her. "Miss Marsh," Dane said, and the warmth was gone now, scraped clean. "We really do need to talk." "We do," Elsie said. "Good. With a lawyer." She let that land. "Present. Mine." Dane's smile flatlined. The silver-haired man spoke for the first time. His voice was smooth and cold, and it had gravel at the bottom of it. "Young lady," he said, "you have no idea what you're holding." Elsie looked at him, and she thought about her mother. 25 and laughing on a beach, 46 and dying with the secret in her fist, running for 20 years so her daughter could stand exactly here, exactly now, holding exactly this. "You're wrong," Elsie said. "I know exactly what I'm holding." She pulled the door down, metal screaming. She locked it. She put the small silver key in her coat pocket next to the big one, next to the letter, next to the business card that told her they could make this easy. She picked up the lockbox, and she walked past them. Neither man moved to stop her, but she felt their eyes on her back the whole way down. 40 stories of dead concrete winding down around her, the caged bulbs stuttering the smell of old paper and salt in her throat. And she did not walk faster, and she did not look back, and she did not let one single thing she was feeling reach her face. Not until she pushed through the tin door at the bottom and out into the raw, gray cold, and crossed the gravel lot, and set the lockbox down on the passenger seat where her brother could see it. "What's in the box?" Milo asked. Elsie looked up at the tower, at the 4 frozen clocks. 3:47. "Grandpa," she said quietly, trying the word out. It didn't fit yet, but it would. And something somebody was willing to hurt a lot of people to keep buried. She started the car, and she pulled out of the lot with a dead man's fortune on the seat, and a killer's confession in her coat, and 22 years of her mother's silence, finally starting to make sense. Warren Shaw looked at the documents for 2 hours and said almost nothing. He was a semi-retired attorney, Roz's neighbor's husband, 25 years in real estate law before he'd taken a teaching job and, in his words, started sleeping through the night for the first time since Reagan. He was a small, careful man with reading glasses that lived on the end of his nose, and Roz had called him the same night Elsie came down from the tower. Now he sat at Roz's kitchen table under the yellow light, the deed in front of him, the survey, the purchase agreement, and that torn notebook page. He read them slowly. He read them twice, and the longer he looked, the more still he got. Finally, he took off his glasses. "Where did you find these?" he said. "In a lockbox, in the tower." He rubbed his eyes. "These are originals," he said. "I'd stake my license on it. This survey is signed by a county surveyor I happen to know. Man named Halloran. He retired in the 90s. He set it down like it was made of glass. "Miss Marsh, if these are what they look like." Then Alden Ferris owned 4 acres of prime Portland waterfront, right up until the day he died. No matter what any court's been told. Elsie sat very still. "Do you know what that land is worth?" Warren asked. "No." He was quiet a moment. "The harbor's been redeveloped for a decade," he said. "That specific parcel, conservatively." He paused. 40 to 60 million, depending on the development rights, possibly more. The kitchen went silent. Roz set down her mug. Milo, asleep down the hall, coughed once and settled. Elsie put her hands in her lap, where nobody could see them, and she said the only thing she could find. "It was left to me." She showed Warren the last line of the note that night. "The bookkeeper made copies. See, Marsh knows. She has to be dealt with before she talks." She watched him read it. She watched a real estate lawyer's careful face go somewhere it hadn't been in years. "See, Marsh," he said slowly. "Colette." My mother. You're saying. He stopped. He started over. You're saying your mother was the one who found the fraud. I'm saying she found it. She copied it. And she ran with me before they could stop her. Elsie's voice didn't shake. She'd decided it wouldn't. She spent 20 years hiding, and I thought it was shame. I thought I was the shame. She pressed her lips together. I wasn't. I was the reason she survived. Warren looked at the note for a long time. Then he did something Elsie didn't expect. He reached across the table, and he covered her hand with his, an old man's hand, spotted and warm. I'm going to help you, he said. Pro bono, and I have people who'll want in on this the second they hear it. He tapped the note. Because this isn't just a property fight anymore, Miss Marsh. This is fraud against the court. This is a criminal matter. And that. He looked up at her. That changes everything. For 9 days, it almost felt like hope. Warren brought in 2 more attorneys, a former federal prosecutor named Angela Dunmore, sharp as a filleting knife who'd built her name on fraud cases, and a young property specialist named Devin Okafor, who could take a mountain of documents and make it make sense to a jury of tired strangers. They worked at Roz's kitchen table. They spread the tower's contents across it in stacks. They authenticated. They cross-referenced. They found the surveyor Halloran alive in a nursing home in Bend, willing to swear his signature was real. Elsie learned words she'd never needed before. Provenance, chain of custody, quiet title. She learned them fast, because she'd always learned fast. It was the only thing poverty had ever given her for free. And for 9 days she let herself picture it. An apartment, 2 bedrooms, a door she could lock behind her, Milo with a bed of his own, and a school he could walk to. Pancakes on a real table on a Sunday morning. 9 days. Then Kestrel stopped playing nice. They didn't come for the documents. They came for her. It started with a phone call. A woman from the state. Cool and professional in the way that professional people are cool when they're about to ruin your life politely. Miss Marsh, this is Denise Kroll, Child and Family Services. Elsie's stomach dropped through the floor. We've received a report, Kroll said, regarding the welfare of a minor in your care. Milo Marsh, age 8. A report. Elsie's mouth had gone dry. From who? I'm not able to share that. Is he not fed? Is he not loved? Is he not the only thing Miss Marsh, nobody's accusing you of anything. We just need to schedule a home visit to confirm the child has stable housing and a stable guardian and adequate income. Stable housing, stable guardian, adequate income. Elsie was a 22-year-old woman living in her aunt's spare room. No lease, no job in this state, no address that was really hers. On paper, she had nothing. On paper, she was exactly what a report like this needed her to be. Who filed this? Elsie said again. Quiet now, dangerous now. I'm not able to share that. But she didn't need to, because Elsie already knew. She told Warren. She watched his face harden. It's them, she said. We can't prove that. I don't need to prove it. I need to know it. And I know it. She stood up. She walked to the window. Outside in the dark, Roz's porch light threw a small yellow circle on the grass. And beyond it, nothing. They can't win on the documents anymore, so they're going to take Milo, because they know it's the one thing I can't fight and hold everything else at the same time. Elsie, they read me right. Her voice cracked. Just once. She hated that. That's the worst part, Warren. They read me exactly right. They know I'll drop the land in a heartbeat if it means keeping him. They're counting on it. Warren was quiet. Then he said the thing she needed to hear and hated hearing. Then don't let them make you choose. Here is what a home visit is. It is a stranger in your kitchen with a clipboard, opening your refrigerator, counting your food, looking at where a child sleeps and writing something down you can't see. It is smiling at your little brother and asking him gentle questions with sharp edges. Do you feel safe? Do you get enough to eat? Does your sister ever leave you alone? And Milo, 8 years old, loyal as a dog and twice as honest, answered every single one. She never leaves me alone, he told the woman, proud. Even when she's really tired, even when she cries in the bathroom so I won't hear it, she still reads me the dragon book, every night. The woman wrote something down. Elsie stood in the doorway and pressed her fingernails into her palms and did not make a sound, because Milo had just told a stranger the truest, most damning, most beautiful thing about their whole life, that his sister cried where he couldn't hear it, and still showed up. And Elsie didn't know if that would save her or sink her. That was the thing about being poor that nobody understood. Even your love could be used against you. Even your best moment could go in a file, under a heading, in a column, as evidence. Denise Kroll left, polite to the end, and the second the door closed, Elsie went to the bathroom and locked it, and sat on the floor and finally let it come. Silent, shoulders shaking, a hand over her own mouth so her brother wouldn't hear, because they'd found it, the one seam, the one place she couldn't armor. They couldn't take the tower, so they'd take the boy. And Elsie Marsh, who had faced down a landlord and a drunk at table 9, and a manager who wanted her to work every Sunday of her life, sat on a bathroom floor and understood for the first time that she might actually lose. Then she stood up. She washed her face, and she went back out. Because Milo was hungry, and a hungry 8-year-old does not care about your despair. The betrayal came 3 days later, and it came from inside the house. Angela Dunmore, the prosecutor, called an emergency meeting. She had a folder. She set it on the table, and her face was the face of a woman who had found something rotten under a floorboard. "We have a leak," she said. "A leak," Warren repeated. "Kestrel filed a motion this morning to seal the tower unit pending a provenance challenge, which is normal, except—" Angela slid a page across the table. "The motion cites the exact contents of that lockbox, item by item, the deed, the survey, the Pruitt note." She let it sit. "Only 5 people in the world know what's in that box, the 4 of us, and one other." The room went cold. Elsie's mind ran the list. Warren, Angela, Devon, herself, and the estate lawyer, she said. Vane. Angela nodded slowly. "Edmund Vane, Hollis and Vane, the man who sent you the letter that started all this." She tapped the page. "He's the only other person with a complete inventory of that unit, and Kestrel's motion reads like he wrote it himself." Elsie sat back. The man who found me, she thought. The man who mailed me the key to my own life. That man, selling us out. "Why?" she said. "Why would he—" "Money," Angela said flatly. "It's always money. Alden's estate is enormous, and Vane's had his hands on it for years. My guess, Kestrel got to him a long time ago. He's been feeding them the whole time." She looked at Elsie. "That warning at the bottom of your letter, seek counsel before you act. That wasn't him protecting you. That was him covering himself, making a record, so when it all came out he could say he told you to be careful." Elsie stared at the table. The polite paragraph, the careful ice-walking words, considerable interest from other parties. He hadn't been warning her. He'd been placing a bet on which way she'd fall. She went back to the tower alone. She shouldn't have. Warren would have killed her. But there were boxes she hadn't opened, and a feeling she couldn't shake. That Alden hadn't left her everything on that one table. That a man that careful, that afraid, would have built in more than one lock. So on a gray Thursday, she left Milo with Roz, and she drove out to Harbor View Road, and she climbed 40 stories of dead concrete alone. Foley let her up without a word, though he watched her go with something worried in his face. And the tower was worse alone. The caged bulbs, the cold that got into the joints, the smell of old paper and salt and time. She unlocked 41. She hauled the screaming door. She turned on the stuttering light, and she started opening boxes. Correspondence. Personal. She went through it letter by letter now. Her mother's hand appeared again and again. Letters started and never sent. Drafts. Colette had written to Alden for years and mailed almost none of it. Elsie read a woman she'd never met. Young, furious, in love and betrayed by it. Pregnant and terrified. Choosing over and over in ink she never sent to protect her child instead of herself. I could tell the world what they did. One draft read, "I have the copies. I could burn Kestrel to the ground. But if I do, they'll come for us. And I have a daughter now, and she is worth more than being right." Elsie sat on the cold floor and read her mother choose her, over and over, in letters no one was ever meant to see. She is worth more than being right. Her mother had held the same bomb Elsie held now, 20 years ago, and she'd chosen not to light it, because lighting it meant risking a 2-year-old with dark curls who slept like the world owed her nothing. Colette had swallowed the truth, for 2 decades, to keep her daughter breathing, and then, at the very end, when the girl was grown, when it gets bad enough, she'd handed it over, not as a weapon, as an inheritance. Elsie almost missed it. She was putting the letters back, reaching to the very back of the bottom shelf, and her knuckles hit something. Behind the boxes, flush against the curved concrete wall, a seam. She pulled the boxes out, and there, set into the wall itself, painted the same dead gray as everything else, so you'd never see it unless you touched it. A small steel panel, a little door, with a keyhole. Elsie's heart began to pound. She reached into her coat, the 2 keys, the big one for the unit, the small silver one for the lockbox, and a third thing she'd forgotten she had, because it had been in the manila envelope all along, taped behind the photograph so small and flat, she'd taken it for a stiffener. A third key, smaller even than the silver one. She'd carried it for weeks and never known. Her hand shook as she fitted into the panel. It turned. The little door swung open, and inside the wall of a dead clock tower in a space no bigger than a shoebox, Alden Ferris had hidden one last thing. 2 objects. A small handheld recorder. Old. The kind with a cassette. A strip of tape on it in that careful hand, "Play Me," and an envelope. Thicker than the first. Heavier. Sealed. And written on the front 4 words that stopped Elsie's breath. For when they come, he'd known. Not that they might, that they would. He'd built the whole tower around the certainty of it, and he'd left her a second envelope for the exact moment she was standing in right now. Kestrel closing in. A leak in her own camp. A caseworker counting the food in her fridge. For when they come. Elsie sat down against the wall. She held the recorder in one hand, the envelope in the other. She pressed play. The tape hissed. Then a voice, thin, old, tired in the bones, but steady. The voice of a man saying something he'd waited years to say. "If you're hearing this, Elsie, then they came, just like I knew they would. And you're afraid, and you're tired, and you're wondering if it's worth it." A breath, a wet, careful breath. "It's worth it. Let me tell you why." Elsie leaned her head back against the cold concrete of her father's tower, and she listened. The tape ran for 11 minutes, and in 11 minutes a dead man handed her the whole war. He told her where to find Elias Pruitt, the man who wrote the note, the one whose confession was buried in the lockbox. Pruitt was alive, old and sick, and hiding out in a town in Arizona, drowning in a guilt that had never once let him sleep. Alden had found him years ago, had talked to him, had a name and a street, and a promise that if it ever came to it, Pruitt would talk, because Pruitt wanted to talk. Pruitt had wanted to talk for 20 years. And then Alden told her about the trust. "I couldn't fix what I did to your mother," the tape said. "I couldn't fix what I did to you, but I could make sure they never got what they killed her running from." A pause. "So I built a trap. Read the papers in the envelope. But I'll tell you the short version now, because you deserve to hear it in a voice, and not just on paper." Elsie opened the envelope with shaking hands. "The land under Cormorant Terminal," the tape went on, "does not pass to Kestrel if they win. It does not pass to Kestrel if they lose. It cannot pass to Kestrel at all, because I placed it in an irrevocable trust years ago, with a condition written into the bones of it. If fraud is ever proven in the taking of those documents, the land converts automatically into housing for women and children with nowhere to go." A dry, tired laugh. "They've been fighting for 8 years to take a thing that turns to smoke the second the truth comes out. They just didn't know it. They still don't." Elsie stopped breathing, because she understood all at once what she was holding. Kestrel wasn't fighting for land anymore. They were fighting to keep the truth buried. Because the moment the fraud was proven, the moment Pruitt's confession hit a courtroom, they didn't just lose the case. They lost the entire prize. The land vanished from their reach forever, turned into the exact thing her mother had been, a shelter for women running with children in the dark. Alden had made it so that the only way to win the land was to keep the crime hidden, and Elsie was about to drag the crime into the light. "There's one more thing," the tape said, and here the old voice changed, got softer, got heavier. "You have a brother, not Milo, a half-brother. My son. His name is Wesley." Elsie went cold. "I was a bad father to him, the way I was a coward to your mother," Alden said. "I gave him money instead of love, and he grew up hating me for it. Rightly. We haven't spoken in 12 years. He may fight you for all of this. He'd have grounds, and if he does, I understand it. But Elsie, I don't think he will, because whatever else my son is, he is not his father. He was never afraid of the things I was afraid of. Find him, tell him the truth, all of it, and then let him choose. That's the one thing I never did for anyone. I never let them choose. Let him choose." The tape hissed to the end and clicked off. And Elsie sat alone in the wall light of her dead father's tower, holding a recorder and an envelope and the shape of a war she now knew she could win. She did not feel like prey anymore. She felt like her mother's daughter. She drove back through the fog with the recorder on the passenger seat and a plan assembling itself in her chest piece by piece like a bone knitting. She would find Pruitt. She would tell Warren about the trust, and she would find Wesley Ferris before Kestrel did. Because if the leak was vain, then Kestrel knew about Wesley too, and a bitter, disinherited son was exactly the kind of weapon they'd try to buy. She got to him first. It took Devon 2 days to trace him. Wesley Ferris lived 4 hours south in a small house that was nothing like the house a billionaire's son should live in. He built furniture, by hand. He'd cut his father off and cut the money off with him and built a quiet life out of wood and sawdust and distance. Elsie drove down alone. She stood on his porch. She knocked. The man who opened the door had Alden's eyes. She knew them from the photograph, and he looked at her, this stranger on his step, with the flat-guarded face of a man who'd learned long ago that people who found him usually wanted something. "Whatever it is," he said, "the answer's no." "Your father was Alden Ferris," Elsie said. The door started to close. "He was mine too," she said. The door stopped. Wesley stared at her, and something moved behind his eyes. Doing the math, the age of her, the set of her face, the eyes that matched his own. "He never told me," Wesley said slowly. "He never told me either," Elsie said. "He never told anybody anything. That was the whole problem with him, wasn't it?" And for the first time, Something cracked in Wesley Ferris's guarded face. Something that was almost a laugh. The bitter, recognizing laugh of a person who has just met someone who knows exactly what it was like to be failed by the same man. "You'd better come in," he said. She told him everything. At his kitchen table over coffee he made two strong. The tower, the documents, Kestrel, her mother, the trust that turned the land to housing, and the tape. She played him the tape. She watched a grown man listen to his estranged father's voice and hold very, very still. Find him, tell him the truth, and let him choose. When it ended, Wesley sat quiet for a long time. "You know what he's done here," he finally said, his voice rough. "He set it up so you and I could tear each other apart. His two kids, over a dead man's guilt. That's what a will like this usually does. Rich man dies, leaves a mess, watches from wherever he ended up while everybody who's left claws at what he was too scared to hand out while he was alive." "Yeah," Elsie said. "That's what it usually does." Wesley looked at her. "Except the land turns to housing if we win," he said slowly. "There's nothing to fight over. Not really. The money in the estate goes to his foundations. The one thing with your name on it, the tower, the land, it stops being ours the second we prove the truth." "Yeah, so he didn't leave us a fortune to fight over," Wesley said. "He left us a fight, and then he made the fortune worthless to anyone who'd fight dirty for it." He shook his head slow, and something in his face that had been clenched for 12 years came loose. "The old coward. He finally did something brave, and he waited until he was dead to do it." Elsie almost smiled. "So," she said, "will you fight me?" Wesley Ferris looked at his half-sister, this stranger with his father's eyes and none of his father's fear. "No," he said. "I'll fight with you." Here is what a deposition is. It is a small room with a long table, a court reporter tapping every word into a machine, a camera in the corner, and across from you a wall of lawyers in suits that cost more than a year of your rent. All of them paid to make you feel like a child who wandered into a war. Elsie sat on one side with Warren and Angela. Kestrel sat on the other, Marcus Dane, and beside him the silver-haired man from the tower stairs, Gideon Vry, chairman of Kestrel Capital, the man who had ordered the documents stolen, the man who 20 years ago had written that her mother needed to be dealt with. He looked at Elsie across the table the way a man looks at a debt, and Elsie looked back at him the way her mother never got to. Kestrel's lead attorney went first, and he came in exactly the way Angela had warned her he would. Smooth, patient, deadly. "Miss Marsh, you're 22. "Yes." "No college, no legal training, no background in real estate." "No." "And yet you'd have this court believe that a stack of documents you claim to have found in an abandoned silo, undocumented, unsupervised, with no chain of custody, are the authentic originals in a dispute that has been litigated for 8 years. "I don't need the court to believe me," Elsie said. "I have a surveyor who'll swear his signature is real. I have a document expert who's authenticated the deed. And I have a man named Elias Pruitt." She watched it land. She watched the name Pruitt cross the table and hit Gideon Vry in the chest like a stone. The lawyer didn't blink, but Vry did, just once. A small involuntary flinch, the flinch of a man hearing a ghost's name spoken out loud in a room with a camera in it. "Mr. Pruitt," the lawyer said carefully, "is not a credible." "Mr. Pruitt is here," Angela said. The room went dead quiet. "He flew in this morning," Angela said, sliding a folder across the table. "He's prepared to testify, under oath, to the payment he arranged, to the clerk who took it, and to the man who ordered it." She let the silence stretch. "He's wanted to say it for 20 years. He told us he's tired of carrying it. His words." And Elsie watched something extraordinary happen across the table. She watched a wall of expensive lawyers realize all at the same moment that they had spent 8 years and untold millions building a case on a grave, and the grave had just opened. But Elsie wasn't done, because there was one more thing, the thing they didn't know she knew, the thing that was going to take the ground out from under the whole war. "There's something you should understand," she said, and her voice was quiet, level, the voice she'd built carrying plates and telling drunk men no. "You've been fighting for this land for 8 years, and I need you to hear this, Mr. Vry, directly, because I want to watch your face when you understand it." Warren shifted beside her. Angela had told her not to do this. Elsie was doing it anyway. "My father put the land in a trust," she said, "years ago, with a condition. If fraud is ever proven in the theft of those documents, the land converts automatically. It cannot be sold. It cannot be developed. It becomes housing for women and children with nowhere else to go." She let it sit. "You've been fighting for 8 years to steal a thing that turns to smoke the second the truth comes out. And the truth is coming out. Today, in this room. So win or lose, you never get the land. You never got it. You never could." She leaned forward. "The only thing you were ever really fighting for was to keep my mother's name in the dark. And you lost that the second I opened that door." The room did not make a sound. Gideon Vry's face did something Elsie would remember for the rest of her life. It aged, in real time. 20 years of a man who had never heard the word no watching it arrive at last in the voice of a girl he'd tried to have erased before she could walk. Marcus Dane put a hand on his chairman's arm, and Gideon Vry did not shake it off, which told Elsie everything. It was over. Not that day. The law is slower than that. But it was over in that room. In that silence in the moment, a powerful man understood he'd already lost. The settlement came 4 months later, facing criminal exposure for the records fraud, facing Pruitt's sworn testimony, facing a clerk who'd been located and flipped, facing a chairman whose own board wanted him gone. Kestrel Capital did the only thing left to do. They folded. Gideon Vry was indicted. That was not the settlement. That was the state of Oregon. And that was a different, longer story, but Elsie testified in that one too. And each time she walked into a courtroom, she wore a small color photograph in her coat pocket, a woman laughing on a beach with her hair full of wind, and she was never once afraid. Edmund Vane, the estate lawyer who'd leaked to Kestrel, lost his license and faced charges of his own. The man who found her, who mailed her the key to her own life, and then tried to sell her out, ended with nothing. Elsie did not feel triumph about it. She felt something quieter, the plain arithmetic of a man who'd bet on the wrong daughter. And the report to Child and Family Services was withdrawn. Denise Kroll herself called to tell her. And there was something almost human in the woman's voice when she said the file was closed. Because a caseworker who counts the food in a lot of refrigerators knows the difference between a home that's poor and a home that's failing. And Elsie's had only ever been the first one, the land converted, just as Alden had built it to. And here is the part the story could not have written for itself. Elsie did not become someone else. The world expected her to. The local paper ran the story, and then the regional one picked it up, and then it went somewhere larger, the way stories about hidden fortunes and homeless girls and dead men's secrets sometimes do. And everyone who read it expected the same ending. The girl gets the money. The girl buys the house on the hill. The girl transforms visibly quickly into someone who had always belonged to a different world. That was not what Elsie did. The first thing she did was rent an apartment, 2 bedrooms, nothing fancy. A clean, safe building near a good elementary school Milo could walk to. She paid the deposit and the first month and the last, without doing the math in her head. And when the math didn't come, when her mind reached for the calculator and found nothing there to count, she stood in the empty living room and cried. Not from grief, from the strange, unbearable lightness of a weight she'd carried so long, she'd forgotten it wasn't part of her body. The second thing she did was sit Milo down on the floor of the empty apartment cross-legged, because there was no furniture yet. "We have a home now," she told him. "A real one, and it's ours, and nobody can take it." Milo looked at her with those clear, dark eyes. "Can we have a table?" he asked. Elsie laughed. It came out fast and surprised the laugh of a person who hadn't laughed freely in years. "Yes," she said. "We're going to have a table. Can we have pancakes on it?" "As many as you want." And Milo nodded satisfied and got up to go claim his bedroom. The first bedroom he'd ever had. And Elsie sat on the floor and watched him go and understood that this small boy running to a door he could call his own, this was the entire fortune. Everything else was just paperwork. The third thing took longer. She worked with Wesley on the land, her brother, who turned out to be the kind of man their father should have been and never had the courage to try. Together they saw Alden's trust through. Cormorant Terminal came down silo by silo, the drowned cathedral finally coming apart against the gray sky. And in its place over the next 2 years rose something Alden had drawn but never dared build: housing. For women running in the dark with children on their hips. The exact women her mother had been. The exact gap Elsie had fallen through. The deposits the first and last, the door you could finally lock behind you. Everything that had stood between a mother and safety, Elsie and Wesley built into the bones of it. They named it the Colette Marsh Center. And on the day the first family moved in, a woman named Teresa with 2 kids and a duffel bag and eyes that Elsie recognized from her own bathroom mirror. Elsie was not there for a ribbon or a photograph. She was in her own kitchen, making pancakes. The light coming through the window, the way it had that first empty afternoon. Milo at the table doing his homework, and the whole apartment smelling of butter and syrup, and the one thing Elsie had gone so long without, she'd nearly forgotten its name: safety. She thought about Alden often in those days, a man who'd been afraid his whole life of all the wrong things, afraid of scandal, afraid of feeling, afraid of a young woman who saw through his money. He'd been a coward when it counted when her mother was alive and there was still time. Elsie let herself be angry about that, some days. A quiet, honest anger she didn't push away. But she understood something about fear now that she hadn't before. She'd spent 2 years learning what it cost to be afraid of the wrong things, and Alden had spent a whole life at it. He'd been afraid of rejection, of being too late, of not deserving what he'd walked away from. And in the end, from inside all that fear, he'd managed exactly one brave thing. He'd built a fortress out of paper and left it to the one person who couldn't be bought. And he'd made the treasure worthless to anyone who'd fight dirty for it. And he'd told his son to choose. A coward's courage, the kind that comes too late to fix anything, and just in time to matter. She wasn't afraid of the wrong things anymore. She was afraid of the right ones now. She was afraid of forgetting what the cold motel floor felt like under her feet, afraid of losing the clear, terrible vision that having nothing gives you, that razor sight for what actually matters. She was afraid of becoming someone who forgot that the girl she'd been counting quarters in the gray light was not a failure to be escaped, but a person to be honored. She was not afraid of anything else. On a Saturday in autumn, she drove Milo and Wesley out to the coast. An hour west, the highway opened onto the Pacific, and she drove until she saw a sign for Sable Beach. And she pulled over. The wind off the ocean was cold and immediate, and smelled like salt and distance. Milo ran ahead toward the water arms, out shrieking at the cold. Wesley stayed back, hands in his pockets, watching the boy with the small, careful smile of a man who was still learning how to be part of a family. And Elsie stood at the edge of the sand and took the photograph from her coat. Alden and Colette. This beach. Or one just like it. 2 people afraid of different things standing in the same light. A summer she'd been born out of and never known. She looked at her father's face. She looked at her mother's. Younger than any memory. Laughing. Loved. Genuinely loved by a man too frightened to keep her, but not, it turned out, too frightened to remember. Her mother had been loved. That mattered. It mattered more than Elsie had expected. And her mother had loved her back so fiercely that she'd swallowed a truth for 20 years and vanished into a small, hard life, and never once complained about the cost. Because a daughter was worth more than being right. A daughter was worth more than justice. A daughter was worth more than everything, right up until the girl was grown and strong enough to hold the truth herself, when it gets bad enough. Look in the tower. Elsie had looked, and she had found the whole thing waiting. Not the money, not the land. Those had turned to smoke exactly as her father designed. What she'd found was proof. Proof her mother wasn't crazy or ashamed or running from nothing. Proof she'd been a woman who found the truth and paid for it with her whole quiet life. Proof that the silence Elsie had grown up inside had not been abandonment. It had been love, wearing the only disguise that could keep her alive. She put the photograph back in her pocket. She thought about inheritance. What it really is. Not property, not money. The accumulated weight of someone's choices handed down, whether you ask for it or not. Their courage and their cowardice. Their love and their silence. All of it passed to you, and then the only question that matters is what you do with it. Whether you let it sit and rot in a vault, or whether you take it and make it move. Make it into something that shelters the next woman running in the dark. That was the inheritance Elsie chose. Down at the waterline, Milo called her name over the sound of the waves, his voice bright and unafraid, the voice of a child who has never once been given a reason to fear the ocean. And Elsie Marsh walked down the sand toward her brothers, toward the water, the sky over the Pacific, the color of pewter and pale gold, where the light broke through the cold wind in her hair, her feet leaving marks in the wet sand behind her. She did not look back at them. She kept walking forward, because there is a kind of dignity that can only be found on the far side of a certain kind of survival, not the dignity of being spared, the dignity of having gone through. Elsie had gone through. She would carry it the rest of her life, and she did not think of it as a scar. She thought of it as a map, a detailed map of every place a floor can give way, and every exit she'd found. And she would spend the rest of her life making sure those exits were there, for the next woman, for the next child, for everyone still counting quarters in the gray light waiting for a letter that might never come, holding on to the one true thing nobody could ever buy or steal or bury. The love that costs everything and never counts the cost.